the subject of origins. Indeed, it is a controversial issue, because there was no one there in the beginning to make observations of what took place. There are basically two views. Evolution is man's speculation on this subject of what took place in the beginning and what happened. And the creation worldview, based on a biblical creationist position, accepts that in the beginning a creator God, all-powerful creator designer, brought things into existence. Now in this presentation we are going to look at and examine the foundational principles of evolution. And if evolution is true, if it can be backed up and supported by the observable evidence, then we can claim that it was a scientific model. But if it cannot be backed up and supported by the evidence, then as a scientist making observations, we should look at ways of changing our theories or ideas or our hypotheses. So let's begin to examine some of these concepts of evolution. First of all, we can ask, where did the idea begin? Who originated the evolutionary idea? Well, as I look back through the various history accounts of the idea of evolution, it can be traced to actually a metaphysical belief which begins from the Hindu belief that over long periods of time there is a progression or a development that occurs from lower levels of consciousness to higher levels of consciousness. So the idea actually goes back to an ancient Eastern religious worldview. And it's interesting that one of the first founding fathers of evolution also based his ideas on a metaphysical worldview. I refer to Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather. You see, in the 1700s, there were a group of individuals in Britain who were looking for a way to explain away God the Creator. It was shortly after the revolution that took place in France, where the church was ridiculed, and literally the Bible was burned, and man was placed in elevation, and God was tossed off the scene. But in Britain, there was a reverence for the Bible, for biblical revelation. And a group of individuals gathered together once a month to have meetings. They called themselves the Lunar Society. And the head of the Lunar Society was an individual by the name of Erasmus Darwin. And so he came up with a view on the origin and the development of life based on a mystical Eastern philosophy that life could progress and develop from lower levels of consciousness to higher levels of consciousness over time. And as I mentioned, they met once a month on the full moon, which may give you some further insights into their spiritual sensitivity. Another very significant individual in the evolutionary worldview, one of the founding fathers, was this gentleman here by the name of Charles Lyell, known as the father of uniformitarianism. His view was that the layers of the earth could be explained by a gradual process that had taken place over very long periods of time. And his motive was to explain away the layers or the stratas which at that time people believed had been laid down by a global catastrophic flood which agreed with the biblical account. And Lyell, being an amateur geologist and a politician, was another one of these individuals, we could call them humanists, who wanted to replace a belief in God with a belief in man. And then, of course, the most famous of the founding fathers, Charles Darwin himself, the grandson of Erasmus Darwin. You see, Charles Darwin was not overwhelmed with facts which caused him to believe in evolution. There came a point in his life where he became disgruntled with biblical Christianity, gave up on believing in God because he had many questions and doubts that were coming to him, and so changed his worldviews and really rewrote what his grandfather had already originated in the books that he had written called the Zoonomia, and came forth with his volume called The Origin of Species. And the idea of evolution, Darwinian evolution, literally has reshaped the thinking of minds around the world. And if there is one thing that's caused people to question the reality of God, the Creator, more than anything else, it is the teaching of evolution. For example, this gentleman took the teachings of Charles Darwin to the extreme. Karl Marx. He was actually associated with Charles Darwin. They lived together contemporaneously in London. And when Charles Darwin came up with his theory of the origin and history of life, Marx was so interested, so excited, that he attempted to dedicate one of his works to Charles Darwin. Marx, as we all know, has become the founding father of communism. And evolution was the basis or a pillar of communism and advanced throughout the former communist world through the indoctrination of scientific atheism. So evolution has had a major impact on the thinking of people around the world. Now today, many universities, colleges, high schools, secular schools are advancing the teaching of evolution as the only credible worldview on the subject of origins. And as I mentioned to you, at one time in my life, I taught from an evolutionary perspective because I believed that what I was taught must be true. Scientists who had studied all their lives on this subject of origins certainly must have assembled the facts, and so I listened to them. And I became part of their thinking. And I advanced that thinking until some changes occurred in my life, and I became a creationist, and then later a Christian. Today, if those people that are in education attempt to resist the teaching of evolution, they're labeled as religious fanatics and attempting to push science back into the Dark Ages. Because the general idea is that evolution has been proven. There is no question whatsoever, they say, that it has happened. This particular publication, called Science and Creationism, A View from the National Academy of Sciences, is a statement by the National Academy of Sciences on their position regarding creationism. They state this: the hypothesis of special creation has over nearly 2 centuries been repeatedly and sympathetically considered and rejected on evidential grounds by qualified observers and experimentalists. And then they go on to say, as a historic representative of the scientific profession and designated advisor to the federal government in matters of science, the Academy states unequivocally that the tenets of creation science are not supported by scientific evidence, and that creationism has no place in a science curriculum at any level, and that its proposed teaching would be impossible. Now that might help you to understand, especially here in the state of California, why there is a movement to advance evolution in the science classrooms without any opposition. And I refer to the science framework for California public schools from kindergarten through grade 12. And in this particular outline or guidelines for curriculum, this statement is made. In order to teach life science, earth science, or astronomy, evolution should be a fundamental central concept of the curriculum. Evolution, which Darwin described as descent with modification, is the central organizing principle in life science. And so tonight, I want to look at the foundational principles of evolution, Darwinian evolution. And we're going to examine these principles, and we're going to test them against the evidence to see whether this statement that the California State Board of Education has made is true. So let's begin. The first principle of evolution. According to the evolutionary idea, in the beginning of time, there was an explosion that took place somewhere in the universe. And of course, the phrase, the Big Bang, is common. The idea that an explosion created all of the order that we see in the universe has been held for many years as an accepted idea. Now, perhaps some of you have seen charts representing this concept. Here's a chart out of a science yearbook indicating that an explosion took place, and as a result of this explosion, we're told that everything that exists in the universe is coming into being, including the planet Earth. And then on the planet Earth, we see that atoms have become molecules. Then molecules have come together to become single-celled life. Then single-celled life has progressed and developed to become multicellular life. And down the chart we see that multicellular organisms become more complex. Mollusks become fish. Fish become amphibians. Amphibians become reptiles. And eventually we see the mammals appear, and eventually man at the bottom of the chart. A product of an explosion and billions of years of time. Now some of you might suggest, how is that possible that scientists could believe this idea? What evidence has there been put forward to support this concept? Well, let's look at another statement which indicates the confidence that some have in this Big Bang thesis. Here's an article from a Science Digest article entitled "The First Billion, 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 Billionth of a Second." And then, using a simple system of logic, we can now deduce in exact detail just what happened during the first split second of creation. Now, isn't it amazing what scientists can do when you think about it? They say they can go back to that minute fraction of a second, billions of years ago in the past, and tell us what took place using logic. But think for a moment. What does your logic tell you about explosions? Has anyone ever observed an explosion that has created order? Not that I know of. Well, if it's happened, then it should be scientifically reproducible and observable. And we should be able to explode some objects and make some observations to see order progressing. That has never occurred. And I would challenge anyone to perform experiments, one after another, to find out whether or not it's possible for an explosion to produce order from disorder. You see, given common sense and logic and the laws of physics, we see that things proceed in a direction from order to disorder, not disorder to order. For example, the second law of thermodynamics clearly indicates to us that given time, things proceed in this direction. Let's use this illustration. If you're to take a pile of blocks and stack them up neatly, given time, that pile of blocks would eventually degenerate and break down. Or if you bought a brand new car and placed it in a garage and left it there for 100 years, do you think it would get better? No, it would degenerate, deteriorate, break down. Our bodies are aging. Cells break down. The sun is burning out. Things are proceeding from order to disorder. And yet evolution, contrary to the physical or observable evidence, says that disorder can become order given time. Random chance events. So the very foundational principle of evolution seems to be in question. Secondly, evolution teaches that non-living material can actually become living material given time, long periods of time. Now, again, has anyone ever observed this? Has this ever taken place? Have we ever seen non-living elements joining themselves together to becoming life? If evolution is true, then we should be able to find this kind of evidence. And once again, we can make observations, and if evolution can't be backed up by observations, then we need to change our theories. This is a typical explanation that evolutionists have regarding this subject of origins, taken from a science textbook for children. The book is entitled Giants of the Animal World. The author is Benjamin Bova, and he says this: scientists are not sure of how it happened, but they believe that life began about 2 billion years ago in the shallow waters of some unknown seacoast. Now notice, they're not sure of when it happened, how it happened, or where it happened, but they believe that it happened by this process called evolution. When we were doing our film documentary, The Evolution Conspiracy, we traveled to many different locations, museums, universities. We went to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and we interviewed the curator of the non-life-to-life portion of the museum. And we asked him this question: as an evolutionist, could you explain to us how non-life became life? And so he was standing there in front of the cameras, the lights were on him, and he began his explanation. And he tried 3 times to come up with a explanation, and 3 times stuttered, stammered, and stopped. And finally he said, I'm sorry, I just can't formulate the words. I can't get the right words today to describe this process, and you're just going to have to find somebody else. And so he wouldn't say any more, and he wouldn't sign the release so that we could use his statement in the film. And the cameraman was putting the camera away, and this curator at the museum started to chuckle, and he said to the cameraman, he said, I shouldn't tell you this, but you know, this part of the museum is just a bunch of nonsense. He said, there's no evidence to support what I'm trying to tell you. It's all speculation. And the reason he said that is because he was attempting to explain the origin of life by pointing to a mural similar to this here, showing a lightning bolt striking a pond, and the claim was that life originated. Well, they also had a cartoon theater at the Smithsonian as well, which explained the origin of life, called the Chon-Chon Theater. Carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen were cartoon characters. And they joined hands together, and after a little song and dance, they snap their hands, and away they come together, and they become a cell. But cartoons and murals do not prove anything. If this is scientifically verifiable and true, then we must see the evidence. We must see non-life becoming life. And that's not been observed. You see, over 300 years ago, they believed that if you laid garbage outdoors, it would eventually turn into flies, and then maggots, and then rats. Because they believed in spontaneous generation. And then a scientist by the name of Francesco Redi decided that he would prove scientifically that this was not the case. And so he took the garbage, covered it over with screen with very small holes, and of course flies were not able to get to the garbage nor the rats, and he proved you cannot get living creatures from garbage spontaneously. And today we think that's rather funny. How could they have believed in that in the past? But when we look at the charts which depict evolution, we have the same idea. For we are told that in the past, a long time ago, atoms became molecules, became complex molecules, became single-celled organisms by a process of spontaneous generation. You see, time seems to have a major impact on our thinking. When we look at things around us today, all living creatures that we can observe, we know that they have come from previous living organisms. In fact, that's a law of biology. It's called the law of biogenesis. Life comes from pre-existing life. And that agrees with the creationist perspective. The third foundational principle of evolution deals with one single word: time. For evolution, time is absolutely essential. It is what I call the magic factor. It makes an improbable, impossible, unbelievable idea seem like it may have happened. Let me illustrate to you how important time is. If I were to, for example, go to one of the universities, colleges in this area, and claim that I wanted to write a new doctoral thesis on the subject of the origin of mankind, and I took with me a jar of single-celled organisms, an amoeba, and I said, I believe that these single-celled organisms can become men in the matter of a few minutes or a few hours. What do you think would happen? I would be looked at like I was crazy. But if I went to the same institute and I said, I believe that a single-celled organism like an amoeba can become a man over millions and millions of years of time, and I'd like to write my doctoral thesis on the subject, what do you think would happen? I would be told, well, you're too late. We already believe this. In fact, I would be shown the Darwinian tree of life with the amoeba at the bottom and the man at the top. You see, these long, long, extended periods of time have made this impossible idea seem like it could have happened. Now, the issue of time is very important for many creationists. And I'm often asked, how old do you think the earth is? And I can honestly tell you, I do not know. And I don't know of any other person that knows how old the earth is. Oh, many people claim they do. You've perhaps heard all of the scientific claims, well, we know that the Earth is 4.51 billion years old. Well, how do they know that? Was anyone there in the beginning to start the clock? No. So there are a lot of assumptions go into the dating of the Earth. Now, it's interesting when you study the history behind evolution that the time concept actually began from a Hindu philosophy, believing in these long periods of time that allowed reincarnation to develop over hundreds of millions of years, process after process, lower to higher. But the idea was really popularized when this chart was put forward in the 1700s by James Hutton and, as we said earlier, Charles Lyell, who suggested that the layers of the Earth were formed by gradual events taking many, many millions of years to form. And so arbitrarily, this chart was put together trying to estimate the age of the Earth based upon the present being the key to the past. In other words, they stated that the same erosion that occurs today and the same amount of volcanic activity has always occurred at the same rate in the past as it occurs today. Again, that's not a scientific observation because we don't know what took place in the past. We weren't there to observe it. Now, again, if someone asks me, how old is the Earth? I say, I don't know, but as a Christian, I don't believe that we have a lot of time left. Things are happening around us which indicate things are winding down. We're living in very significant days. Now, with this issue of time, there have been a number of dating techniques which have caused many people to say, well, I believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that the Earth is billions of years old. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, because of radiometric dating. And so we've been told that methods such as uranium, lead, and potassium argon are very, very accurate as a Swiss watch. Now, first of all, we need to know what these dating methods state that they date. And uranium, lead, and potassium argon radiometric dating methods are designed to date the age of formation of volcanic materials. Only volcanic materials. Now, perhaps you have read some articles and you've heard some of the dates that radiometric dating techniques have performed. For example, here is Skull 1470, a famous fossil found by the Leakey family. And it's claimed to be nearly 3 million years old. Now, how did they date it? They did not date the skull. They dated volcanic rock in the surrounding layers. Or here's another fossil find, Lucy. It's also claimed to be in the area of 3 million years old. And also, it wasn't the fossil that was dated, it was the volcanic rock that was dated in the surrounding area. So we hear about all of these dates, and that they're supposedly very, very accurate. But let me tell you something. There are some problems with radiometric dating techniques. And let me illustrate to you some of those problems. From the Journal of Geophysical Research, Volume 73, July 15th, 1968, lava rocks that had been formed in Hawaii in 1800 and 1801, dated by potassium argon, showed an age of formation of 160 million to 3 billion years old. Or here's another one. Lunar soil dated from some of the Apollo tests. 4 different lead methods gave 4 different answers. 4.6 billion, 5.4 billion, 4.8 billion, 8.2 billion. And lunar rocks dated by potassium argon dated 2.3 billion from Science, Volume 167, January 30, 1970. Now here's a question that you should ask. If we can't date the formation of volcanic rocks of an age that we know it was formed, if we can't be confident about that, how do we know we can be confident about the age of formation of volcanic rocks when we don't know when it was formed? And I don't think we can be. We found when we were doing some of the research for our evolution film that if you take a volcanic rock to a radiometric lab, they won't date it unless you tell them what layer it was found in. In other words, they want to know how old it is, which gives me some idea that even the dating labs question the methods as well. Well, then there's carbon-14. And people often confuse the radiometric methods for dating volcanic rock with carbon-14, which dates the age of death of a specimen. So it dates organic material. When living things die at that moment, they do not take in carbon-14. And then through technological means, we're able to measure the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. All living things contain a certain amount of carbon-14, which is either ingested through the food that is eaten or through the air that plants take into them. And radioactivity that occurs in the atmosphere as a result of cosmic radiation bombarding nitrogen atoms produces carbon-14. So the moment an organism dies, it does not take the carbon-14 into its system. And so they measure the ratio of C14 to C12, and knowing the half-life or the rate of degeneration, they determine the age of death. Now that all sounds very well, but it's based upon an assumption that carbon-14 has been constant in the atmosphere over time. Well, there's a problem with that. How do we know that it's been constant? Volcanic activity changes the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. How do we know the rate of volcanic activity in the past? Cosmic catastrophes change the rate of carbon-14 to carbon-12. In 1918, in Siberia, in a place called Tanuska, something from the heavens slammed into the earth. They don't know what it was, whether it was an asteroid or a comet. It was like a nuclear explosion. And it flattened trees, just blasted them like a nuclear explosion in a radius of 30 miles. And the following year, carbon-14 in tree rings doubled all over the world. Or other reasons. Solar flare activity can change the rate of radioactivity and carbon-14 formation. Or we can look at another example, the pollution of our environment, and that's what's happening today. The ozone layer is depleting. As a result, radiation is intensifying, and carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratios are changing. So there are some problems. And again, when we look at measurements, we see that it also illustrates problems. For example, organic material in mortar that was in a castle that was built 785 years before this dating method was taken actually was built 7,370 years previously. So there was a problem there. Or seals that had been freshly killed, dated that they had been dead for 1,300 years. Or coal that had been dated by carbon-14, dated 1,680 years old in the age of formation, when it actually, by the geological time scale, was supposed to have been 100 million years. Evolutionists believe that the complexity of life can be explained by a process that has taken place over time, chance and random events. So evolution believes that every living thing that we see around us on our Earth can be explained by a natural process. But is that logical? Is it reasonable to say that complex life can just come onto the scene by process and then develop over time through accumulations of mistakes? Well, let's look at the very simplest component of life, the single cell, which is the basic unit of life, but it's not simple. And as we look at the cell and we see the many structures which make up the cell in the cytoplasm, the various organelles, we see that the cell can't function unless each one of these organelles is present, all of which have specific functions. Did this happen by chance? Now, while we're looking at this particular slide, this picture has a very important thing for me, because it was this particular picture that I looked at about 15 years ago which caused me to question what I believed. See, one night I was sitting in my living room and I was looking around. I saw a painting. And thought came to me, well, the painting had an artist. I looked down on the table, a biology textbook that I had been reading from was sitting there. And the thought came to me, the book had an author. And the table that the book is sitting on had a carpenter. And I opened the textbook and I opened to this cell. And it struck me. Cells are more complex than paintings and books and tables. There must have been a constructor, a designer, an engineer. And it was the first time since I had been a teenager that I entertained the idea that there just might be a God. And that began a chain of events which caused me to change my perspective, my worldview. You see, cells are complex, very complex, more complex than an entire city, like the city of Los Angeles, made up of all of the communication networks and transportation networks and the power plants that generate energy. Very complex. But evolution says that it can be explained by a process of chance. If we look at the nuclear area of the cell, which contains the blueprints of life, or a molecule called DNA, we find that all of the information that was necessary to code the information which makes you and I, makes our bodies, was contained within this particular molecule that makes up the chromosomes, or the blueprints of life. How could this have happened by a process of chance? Extremely complex. One biologist has said this, trying to describe the complexity of a cell. Even if we knew all there is to know how a cell works, we would still be baffled. How nerve cells create emotions, thoughts, behavior, memory, and other perceptions cannot yet, if indeed ever, be described in the language of molecular biology. And that's a very honest statement. If scientists are honest and they look at the complexity of living organisms, they have to say, it's amazing. It cannot be explained by a process of mistakes over time. There is a phase of biological engineering which actually attempts to mimic the complexity in the design that we see in living organisms. Looking at the living things, engineers copy or design from their complex systems and produce inventions. And let me show you some of these comparisons, called bionic comparisons. For example, as a bat flies through the atmosphere, it emits frequencies from its vocal cords, which go out in front of the bat, and then these frequencies are bounced back to the bat's brain so that the brain can determine what the objects are in front of it, whether or not to intercept the object or fly around the object. An amazing system which we are told is the product of evolution. And yet when we look at a radio telescope or a radar system, no one would say that that happened by evolution. It was a product of intelligent design. Or tonight, as you are observing these visuals, your eye is picking up frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum. They're being converted in the back of your eye electrochemically and then transmitted via the optic nerve to your brain, and these images are recorded there for as long as you live. Well, that happened by evolution, we're told, by mistakes that accumulated over long periods of time. Yet no one would ever suggest that a video system just happened by a process of evolution and long periods of time. The human brain, the most complex computer that has ever been studied, made up of literally billions of cells, some of them interconnected as much as 60,000 times with other cells. The brain monitors and controls all of your bodily functions while you are asleep, while you are awake. Everything which you have sensed through your perceptions, through your senses, is recorded in your brain for as long as you live. But that evolved, we're told. Yet no one would look at a man-designed computer system and say that that happened by a process of chance. So where is the logic? If living things are more complex than the things that man designs from them, could it not be possible that living things were also designed? According to Darwin's theory, they attempt to explain this complexity and design of life from simple to complex by saying not only was there time, but mutations occurred and natural selections. And certainly there is no question that mutations do not occur. They do occur. But the majority of mutations are degenerative or harmful. For example, the Drosophila has been bombarded with everything imaginable, and all kinds of mutations have been produced. Bent wings, no wings, all kinds of body deformities. But no one has ever observed anything other than a Drosophila resulting from a mutation. Mutations are mistakes in the genetic code, but they do not improve the quality of life. According to the evolutionary worldview, mutations coupled together with natural selection bring this new quality or new order of life. And again, natural selection does occur. The environment does select out the best suited of life to perpetuate life. And let me show you an example how natural selection might work. Let's say, for example, you had two different varieties of the dog kind, a St. Bernard and a Chihuahua, and you took them to the Arctic Circle in the wintertime when the temperature was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And you left the dogs there, took them out for a walk, and they got lost in a blizzard. What do you think might happen? Well, likely the Chihuahua wouldn't survive, and the St. Bernard, being better equipped for the extremely cold conditions, could survive. So the environment, the temperature in this case, selected the best suited of what already existed. That's how natural selection works. And that does agree with the biblical creationist perspective, because through time there have been extinctions of life that occurred. Many more life forms in the past than exist today. So today, many people are questioning some of these concepts of Darwinian evolution because we have not found the evidence which supports mutations and natural selection producing new forms of life. Well, what evidence is there to support that simple can become complex, that evolution is true? As I mentioned, in the past there were more varieties than there are today. Let me give you an illustration. The chambered nautilus. Today there are only a few varieties, 6, and their size is approximately 8 to 10 inches in diameter. In the past, the chambered nautilus varieties extended to more than 3,500, and their size 8 to 12 feet in diameter. So there has been a degeneration. Or in many cases, we see that when we look at fossils and we see their counterparts today, there isn't any change at all. For example, here is a bat that is alleged to be 50 million years old, but it is identical to the bat today, no change. Or here are some insects preserved in amber. Mosquito that's claimed to be 40 million years old, it's like the mosquito today. An ant that's supposed to be 50 million years old, it's like the ant today. A praying mantis that's supposed to be millions and millions of years old, it's like the praying mantis today. There's no change. The fossil record shows that either life is degenerated or there hasn't been any change. And when we look at the complexity of life, we can't explain how complex organ systems can come into being by a process of mistakes over time. And again, once again, common sense and logic tells us that there has to be some alternative explanation. For example, when we look at the human body, we could look at any organism and see that it's made up of a number of organs. How do you explain the evolutionary development, for example, of the circulatory system, which contains a heart and blood vessels that take blood away from the heart, and then capillaries that take the blood to the cells, and then a venous system that takes the blood back to the heart? How do you explain that happening by a process of mistakes over millions of years of time? The circulatory system must be in existence, and it must be functional, or there isn't an organism. The same is true of the pulmonary system, which oxygenates the blood, or the kidney system, or any other organ system. So many people today claim that we can explain the development of life, that there are transitional forms, and that we can look at the fossil record and we can see the development, the progression over time. At least this is what has been taught as one of the foundational principles of evolution. And if evolution is true, there should be many, many links. No shortage whatsoever. There should be hundreds of thousands, millions of these so-called links between one species and another. And so we have seen all kinds of representations which try to show us how these forms develop, one species to another. Not only should we find them in the fossil record, but why shouldn't we find them around us today? Living forms, intermediates between one species and another. So let's look at some of the proposed links. Well, here's an example. It's a painting of a fish crawling out of the water onto the land and sprouting legs. But have they ever found anything like this? No, but you can go to museums and you can see all kinds of these alleged links and paintings and models. Here's an interesting one. It's a whale with legs, and it's walking out of the water. And this particular scientist, when he was hunting through fossil beds in the foothills of the Himalaya mountains, found a skull of a whale and some teeth. And he was very excited because this skull head was a long ways away from water, so he speculated that perhaps the whale had walked there in the past and then somehow it got buried. He didn't find any legs, so he got a grant from the U.S. government to go back the following year to see if he could find them. But meanwhile, he had an artist construct for us what he believed this creature may have looked like in the past. Or then there's Archaeopteryx. For years, claimed to be a link between birds and reptiles because it had teeth in its mouth and claws on its wings. But there are birds today that have claws on their wings. There are birds in the fossil record that have teeth in their mouths, and they're classified as birds. So why should these two characteristics prove that Archaeopteryx was part reptile and part bird? Incidentally, birds that are not any question whatsoever, birds have been found in the fossil record, and by the evolutionist dating techniques and methods, by the stratas, have dated older than Archaeopteryx. So many paleontologists today disregard Archaeopteryx as a potential link between one species and another. Nevertheless, there have been many proposed ideas on how birds have evolved. Here is a National Geographic piece of artwork demonstrating what they think the ancestors of birds looked like in the past. And the author of this particular article says that he too has a problem believing that this actually was an ancestor of his canary. Nevertheless, such ideas are put forward and proposed. Here's an argument between two different groups of evolutionary ideas on the origin of bird flight. One group of scientists believes that birds evolved this way. He says what happened was the ancestors were running along the ground chasing flying insects, which they nabbed with their teeth or their front legs. Longer feathers on the front legs evolved to act as an insect net, and so the legs became wings. Then they used the wings to make flapping leaps after insects. So they believe these things were running along and they had to evolve wings in order to catch insects. Or another group says, no, it didn't happen that way. The ancestors climbed up into trees, and then once they were in the tree, they had to learn how to glide from branch to branch, and so they evolved wings that way. But the question is, have we found any fossils where limbs are evolving into wings? Have we found scales becoming feathers? No. So how do we know that birds evolved from reptiles? We don't. And yet the idea is proposed. And to question such an idea is a religious, fanatical idea for many scientists. We could look at some other examples of links that have been proposed in the past. The Crossopterygian, claimed to have been a creature that lived 90 million years ago, was a link between fish and amphibia. And so whenever they found one of these particular fossils in the layers of the earth, they knew that the layer had to be at least 90 million years old because that's when, according to the geological column, they became extinct. Well, that was all fine and well until a relative of the Crossopterygian fish, the coelacanth, was found live and well caught off the coast of Madagascar in the 1930s. And so no longer could they state that this was a credible missing link, and the layers that had been dated certainly were an embarrassment to the evolutionists. Or the horse series has been claimed to be absolute proof of evolution, and we've all seen the charts showing a rabbit-sized creature at the bottom of the chart progressing and developing, becoming larger and more horse-like, and eventually modern horse at the top of the chart. But what most people are never told, that this chart was put together by neatly placing these creatures together in a sequential order by size. The fossils were found in India, North America, and South America, and then put together in the same chart. In some places, several of them are found in the same layer. They live together contemporaneously. And in some parts of the world, the chart's found upside down. In South America, the older members are the layers closer to the surface of the earth, and the more modern layers are further down in the earth. The chart is upside down. And if we look at a count of their rib pairs, they change from 18 to 15 to 19 back to 18. So how do we know that one evolved and developed into the other? We don't know. Well, one of my favorite missing links is this particular creature here. It's called the dinosauroid, and it actually is a fiberglass model. And it was formed from a tiny piece of jawbone found in Alberta, Canada, by a Dr. Dale Russell, a paleontologist from Ottawa, Canada. And he believes that his dinosauroid is what dinosaurs would have looked like had they evolved. Now, it's a piece of science fiction, and yet it has traveled around the major museums around the world. It was here in Los Angeles, it's been in the Smithsonian, it's been in various museums in Canada, and people look at it and they say, isn't it amazing what evolution has produced? Evolution hasn't produced this. This is man's mind. It's fictitious. It doesn't exist. It's a fiberglass model. But when people look at these particular things, they don't think for themselves. It's pseudoscience. Today, many people have looked to scientists without thinking for themselves, allowing scientists to think for them. Charles Darwin has stated, oh, that's not Charles Darwin, sorry. Charles Darwin has stated, by my theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? You see, in Darwin's day, they hadn't found any missing links, and you know what? They haven't found them today. They don't exist. They do not exist. And so that's why they've had to come up with a new theory for evolution. Because of lack of data, they say, well, there are no intermediates between species, so evolution must take place very quickly. It must go in leaps and spurts and jumps. Punctuated equilibrium. It's a theory based on no data, no intermediates between species. Dr. Colin Patterson from the British Museum of Natural History wrote this letter, which I'm going to read a portion to you, to Luther Sunderland, who appeared in the Evolution Conspiracy, has since passed away. And in this particular letter, as a curator of the museum, he said it this when he was asked why there weren't any missing links in one of the books that he had written. He said, I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. It is easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another and to find reasons why the stages should be favored by natural selection. But such stories are not part of science, for there is no way of putting them to the test. But you see, today, evolutionary ideas, in many cases, are just totally built upon stories. No physical evidence. You see, there are major changes that are taking place in evolutionary ideas today because Darwinian evolution can't be backed up by physical evidence. We're now moving into a new phase of evolution where we're looking to metaphysics to explain the origin of life. And one of these theories that's being put forward is called the new biology, the new paradigm, explaining that there is a force or energy in the universe which guides things from disorder to order. And that's exactly the direction that biology is headed. Darwinian evolution is bankrupt. There isn't any evidence to support it. And so now scientists are moving from a physical explanation to a metaphysical explanation. I refer to an article written in the Omni magazine. In fact, this entire Omni that was the October issue of 1991 is dedicated to evolution. And they talk about these new theories, these new concepts in evolutionary development, where they say an extraordinary new finding suggests that life forms may literally direct their own evolution. And the idea is that the environment guides life forms onward and upward. Incidentally, if you're familiar with the New Age movement, you'll see that punctuated equilibrium and this new paradigm, this new biology, fit in very well. Because the New Age is saying that man is on the verge of taking a step of evolution in the future. And speaking of man, isn't there evidence that apes have evolved and developed into modern man? Well, many people said, well, of course, we know that this happened. We've seen the pictures. We've seen the models. We've seen all of these representations that scientists have given us of what our ancestors looked like. But have we seen any fossils? Sure, we've seen paintings. Sure, we've seen these kinds of creatures, but where's the fossil evidence? Well, I'll tell you, there isn't any fossil evidence, and I don't have time to go into this particular area tonight, but I want to show you what many of the concepts are shaped upon. No evidence. For example, the Leakey family believes they have found the best evidence of what our ancestors were like based on some footprints that they found in Africa. And Richard Leakey has admitted that he's made a 12 million year mistake. He used to believe he could trace our ancestors back 15 million years ago, but now he believes only 3 million years ago, therefore he made a mistake of 12 million years. And he says that some footprints that his mother found in Laetolia, Kenya, show what our ancestors looked like. And so in National Geographic, April 1979, we're shown pictures of footprints that are supposedly belonging to our alleged ancestors. And here Mary Leakey is examining these footprints, measuring them, and we see that there are other footprints in the area as well, some of these alleged ancestors and many other footprints that have been buried in volcanic ash layers that have hardened, covered over by dirt and some turf. And so they investigate the footprints. And here we see some left-right footprints going through the volcanic ash. And the April 1979 edition shows us a man standing beside the alleged ancestor's footprint with his pant leg rolled up and his sock pulled off. And the statement is made, the form of his foot was exactly the same as ours. Now, what did our ancestor look like? Well, they had an artist come in and show us. And they reconstructed the area. And in the footprints that looked like bird footprints, they painted a bird. The same was true with a giraffe. The same is true with an elephant. The same with a rabbit and the ostrich. But in the footprints that look like yours and mine, exactly, they paint a picture of a creature that's part baboon and part human, and that's supposed to be what our ancestors looked like. And many people said, you can't prove to me that creation is true. I've seen our ancestors in National Geographic. They're paintings. We need fossils. And I can tell you the most recent finds, paleontologists that are honest will say, we don't have the evidence. It does not exist. Now, in conclusion, let me make a few statements. Evolutionists are continuing to advance their beliefs as never before. And tonight I brought along with me a book. You see a picture there on the screen. It's called Evolution, the True Story of Origins of Humankind, a three-dimensional book. And Isaac Asimov has endorsement. He says, it combines good detail with ingenious three-dimensional illustration. It's bound to interest the inquisitive youngster. On the back it says, an ingenious work of art and a compelling work of science. Well, what evidence do they have for evolution? Well, you open the first page and a volcano pops up. And they say, this is an act of creation. Countless chance encounters between organic molecules, and eventually life appeared, and then they show us a cell popping out of the page. Then you can see a fish popping out of the page. That's how life moved on the land. And then here's a dinosaur. And then the next page, well, here's our ancestors, Ramapithecus and Australopithecus, walking across the page. But this is the one I like. They say, in just a few million years, down from the trees and onto the moon in just 5 million years. And here's a picture of an astronaut, and he pops up out of the page. What does that prove? Doesn't prove anything. Where is this compelling evidence that evolution has occurred? Why do people believe in it? Because they don't want to believe in creation. You have two choices, to believe in evolution or believe in creation, because both are beliefs. You can't reproduce what took place in the beginning. But you see, behind this, there is something else. There is literally an agenda to advance evolution. Do you know that since 1933, fathered by John Dewey, the father of the Humanist Manifesto, there has been an active program to advance the indoctrination of evolution and using the public schools as the forum to advance evolutionary beliefs. The two principles of the Humanist Manifesto. Number one, there is no God. Number two, the reason we're here is because of evolution. And do you know that today there is an active movement headed up by the American Humanist Association that wants evolution to be the only view presented on the subject of origins? Do you know that men like Isaac Asimov, president of the American Humanist Association, call creationists dangerous because they're pushing science back into the Dark Ages? because they're trying to force upon people there's a God. For the National Academy of Sciences, we showed you earlier, men gathered together to plot a strategy to advance evolution at the expense of creation. And that's why Carol Matrician and I wrote this book called The Evolution Conspiracy, to show people the agenda, humanistic beliefs being advanced in public schools. An idea that we're here as a result of a process of mistakes over millions of years of time, without any evidence to support the idea. Some of these statements that are made today by hostile anti-creationists, Preston Cloud in the Evolution Conspiracy documentary said, "Creationism inhabits the lunatic fringe." Laurie Godfrey, in a book called Scientists Confront Creationism, has said, "The body of scientific misinformation that constitutes the core of creation is reaching a far wider cross-section of the American populace and threatening the scientific literacy of its youth." Do you know that that's why today the science framework is being promoted to advance literacy in science, to advance the idea that evolution is the central organizing principle of life sciences. And do you know that teachers that refuse to teach evolution as a fact are being reprimanded? Perhaps you are following the John Pelosa case. And here in my hand is the paper, Orange County Register, January 17th, 1992, anti-evolution instructors lawsuit thrown out of court. All John Pelosa has been asking to do is to teach science the way it's supposed to be taught, by showing that there are facts that don't support evolution. Pelosa claims he only wants to teach science, but has not comported himself to the manner of one who wants to teach science, the judge said in this case. Pelosa has said that he believes in the biblical story of creation and has refused to follow district guidelines describing evolution as a unifying theory of biology. Well, if there are facts that show that evolution didn't happen, why shouldn't he be able to teach that way? Because there's an agenda to advance evolution without opposition. Now let me quickly conclude. Isaac Asimov has said that creationists are attempting to fasten medieval shackles on the human mind. Carl Sagan, well-known science promoter, has said that evolution is the reason we are here. In his book called The Cosmic Connection, he describes that we are here as a result of 4.5 billion years of fortuitous and slow biological evolution. That's why we're here, he says. But then he makes this statement. He says we should have a reverence for all forms of life because we're all products of evolution. And he says spiders, salamanders, salmon, and sunflowers are equally our brothers and sisters. Now that shouldn't be a surprise if you understand the creation worldview. Because the Apostle Paul says the evidence for creation is so obvious, it is so overwhelming, that if you reject that evidence, you're without excuse. Your foolish heart is darkened. Professing to be wise, you become a fool. And you believe a lie. And then you begin to worship the creation rather than the Creator. And that's exactly the way our world is headed today. We have rejected the overwhelming evidence that God exists, that the creation can be backed up and supported by the physical observable evidence. And we've accepted a metaphysical belief based on Hindu philosophy that time and chance bring things from disorder to order. And further to that, we are believing a lie today that's being propagated around the world that man is going to emerge as a new species for a new era, and we're going to bring peace and prosperity to the planet. The great delusion. Evolution. It's the same lie that Satan gave to Eve in the Garden of Eden. Don't believe in God. Just believe in yourself. Trust in man. And the next phase was to trust in a spiritual dimension, a fallen spiritual dimension, and it brought a great global demise. Evolution has caused more deception than anything that I know. People have lost their faith in God the Creator as a result of believing in this idea that we're here as a result of a process of chance. There is no evidence for evolution, but there is evidence for creation, and there is a Creator.